camera and microphone and just ask you, I presume you might have some visuals you want to show if you, and sorry, Lauren, you've also started recording.
Yeah,
so just so you're aware of that. Feel free to obviously ask questions, but just so you realise it's being recorded. And
yep.
You can take control. Do you know how to do a presentation on this?
No, this is my first chance of doing a presentation on Teams, but I think I should.
If you go up to that picture of a square with an arrow going up to it.
Yeah.
There you go, you've got it. So I'm going to switch off my camera.
Yeah.
So basically, you've got about half an hour. So if you start running too late, I might just intervene, but otherwise.
Yeah, please do.
And introduce yourself, your topic, and what you've come to say today.
Thanks, Andrew. And thanks, Elizabeth, too, for making the time to be here today. I really, really appreciate having your input. It'll be really good to get a political economy perspective on this. So I'm Connor Jolley. I am a PhD student. I studied an undergraduate degree in environmental social science and have a strong interest in workers and climate change. So my project is called Organising for Ownership, Energy Democracy and Prefigurative Interventions in Energy Transitions by Trade Unions and Communities in Victoria, Australia. So just to do a quick introduction, I thought I'd start by introducing the cases that I'm looking at and then just give a brief outline of the presentation. So cooperative power is my primary interest. So it is a non-distributing member-owned electricity retail services cooperative, which was established by the then National Union of Workers, which is now the United Workers Union after they amalgamated with United Voice. So the mission of cooperative power is quite broad. They aim to address the climate crisis, inequality and the decline in civil society participation through delivering a range of environmentally friendly energy services and products. In doing so, they facilitate democratic solutions to social and environmental problems and assist members in the community to transition away from fossil fuels. So cooperative power is unique and important as a research subject in several ways. So first, as a not-for-profit community retailer, cooperative power is a unique and first of its kind intervention in energy transitions or in the Australian electricity market. Secondly, as a union-led initiative, cooperative power is a novel experiment in operationalising principles of just transitions. And third, because it's embedded within global networks and discourses of energy democracy and just transitions, its relations to the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy network are particularly significant. Several key members and member organisations of cooperative power are also members of the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy network. The cooperative is an experiment grounded in the geographical reality of the Australian political economy and the actually existing socio-technical energy system that we find ourselves in, which contrasts with TUED's critique of the role of cooperatives in energy transitions. Indigo Power, it's a social enterprise that provides retail services to customers in the Indigo region of Victoria and southern New South Wales. So it was formed out of the totally renewable Yakandanda project, which aims for energy sovereignty for that community and powering it entirely from renewable energy by 2022. As a social enterprise, Indigo Power supports community development by investing half of their profits back into community energy hubs, but they are essentially a for-profit organisation. So it's not a union-led initiative in the way that cooperative power is, but it does tangentially work towards the same goals of just transitions by creating local employment opportunities and contracting local supplies wherever possible. So as one of the only community retailers in Victoria, it's important because it does embody the ethos of community energy as it's commonly understood, and as it is also critiqued by Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. For my own purposes, it provides a neat one-to-one point of comparison with cooperative power, which will be able to highlight the similarities and differences between the two. Just briefly, on Wednesday night, the Journal of Industrial Relations held a symposium on an upcoming special issue on climate change and industrial relations. So it was attended by scholars from Australia, Canada, and Europe. I had the opportunity to present a draft paper that synthesises these two chapters and a few preliminary results. Overall, the feedback was positive. There were some criticisms around perhaps the focus and the structure, but other than that, they were quite positive about the overall direction of the paper. So I'll begin by talking through the literature. So there are three thematic areas that I'm looking at. The first I'm calling labour, nature and sustainable prefigurative post-capitalist futures. The second is trade unions and energy transitions. And finally, the Australian context. So just a brief overview of the labour, nature and post-capitalist futures literature. I have largely been inspired by environmental labour studies and the call to a research project that explores the environmental policies of unions through the lens of the labour-nature relationship. So that provides an empirical rationale of what unions are doing and what their strategies and their policies are, and then sort of thinking about it in terms of those bigger questions about the relationship between humans and nature. So it's a good set of literatures, but it does have a gap in the sense that it doesn't really engage with socio-spatial dynamics and could probably benefit from some interventions, some geographically informed interventions. In respect to geography, it's important then to think about how the field of geography has looked at labour, in particular the field of economic geography. So that has been understood largely through the lens of labour geography. So labour geography emerged in distinction to how labour was being conceptualised traditionally in economic geography, both in terms of the neoclassical economic geography, which understood labour in terms of location theory and as an input into econometric models that determined where to locate firms. And then also in contrast to Marxist economic geography, which largely understood workers in passive terms, or at least that's what the proponents of labour geography argue. And they wanted to highlight the spatial agency of labour to be able to shape economic landscapes in contradistinction to what transnational capital does. So again, a really rich literature, but a really glaring gap within that literature is a very limited engagement with environmental issues. So there's no real exploration of, especially at a theoretical level, of the nature, the labour-nature relationship. So that's a gap that my research can fill. Another area that I'm looking at is prefigurative politics and sustainable materialism. So commonly, prefigurative politics is commonly associated with anarchist traditions of autonomism. So it's really the principle of acting out the future in the shell of the present. John Holloway employs the crack metaphor to think about how experiments that resist the logics of capitalist reproduction can occur within the interstitial sites where capitalism is, cracking. And how can you advance and create more fissures and fractures within capitalist structures. Prefigurative politics has a strong emphasis on the local as a site of resistance. So that brings that sort of spatial element to thinking about how labour can act in spaces of socio-ecological transformation. However, localism has been criticised as being too disconnected from some of the higher order levels and landscapes at which transnational capital is dominating spaces of energy transitions. So then that means that we need to look at something we need to bring to the framework another way of looking at some of those spatial dynamics. And I propose doing that by looking at a very influential field in the transitions literature, which is socio-technical transitions. So socio-technical transitions, they seek to understand the social and the technical as a single system. It uses principles of complex adaptive systems to understand how they work. It tries to understand how technical innovation contributes to the emergence of new system dynamics. And one of the major heuristic tools I use is the multi-level perspective. It conceptualises socio-technical systems at 3 levels of interaction. The landscape level, which consists of deep structural forces that only shift over decades. The regime level, which consists of deep structural, the regime level, which consists of the rules that determine how various elements of a socio-technical system are reproduced and provide structural stability to the system. And the niche level. So that's where potentially disruptive and radical innovations can be formed and nurtured and potentially diffused through to disrupt the regime level and destabilise it. A limitation of the socio-technical literature is that it's been critiqued as not theorising power or agency particularly well. That's particularly the case with workers and unions. They are very rarely even considered, and where they are, it's quite haphazard. So to advance my theoretical framework, we need a further lens. So I draw on just transitions. Just transitions is dominant within the global labour movement. It is something that is being co-produced with unions to think about how energy transitions and wider socio-ecological transitions can occur without without workers paying the costs of those transitions. So to explore just transitions, I draw on Stevis and Felley's typology, which they have identified 3 just transitions approaches being practiced by global unions. The first is a shared solution approach. It emphasises a mutual understanding and dialogue between labour and capital, probably epitomised in the Australian context by unions such as the Australian Workers' Union, which, for instance, when a carbon price was proposed, they offered conditional support on the basis that it wouldn't cost any manufacturing jobs. The second is a differentiated responsibility approach. It places greater demands for state intervention to create sustainable jobs. That's probably epitomised by unions such as the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, which has lobbied for government intervention to support things like green vehicle manufacturing capacity, or the CFMEU, the mining union, which has advocated for state assistance in developing clean coal technology. And finally, the social ecological approach, which is a more avowedly eco-socialist approach that emphasises democratic planning of the economy, socialised production, and the state ownership of any remaining fossil fuel reserves. It's a much rarer phenomenon within the union movement, probably best captured in Australia though by the Green Bands era of the Builders and Labourers Federation. So my argument here with this is that cooperative power really represents an emergent or re-emergent social ecological approach to just transitions. Another area in terms of energy transitions that is very closely related to the social ecological approach to just transitions is the idea of energy democracy. Energy democracy is recognised as being a kind of a loose term. It generally encompasses any approaches to energy which emphasise participation and democratic ownership of renewable energy infrastructure. That can range anywhere from the very liberal notions of the prosumer. So that might be, an atomised household with solar panels on its roof that's producing and consuming energy within the market, to much more radically communitarian and egalitarian visions of democratic control and ownership of energy infrastructures. So trade unions for democracy, they really represent the communitarian, the radical end of the spectrum. So TUED is a global multi-sector initiative that seeks to advance the democratic direction and control of energy in a way that promotes solutions to the climate crisis, energy poverty, the degradation of both land and people, and responds to the attacks on workers' rights and protections. TUED really are committed to advancing energy democracy within the union movement. they situate the climate crisis squarely within the labour-nature relationship. So they identify the commodification of nature and the expansion of the frontiers of neoliberal capitalism as the root causes of all of these problems. And instead they call for a vision of an energy democracy that resists the hegemonic agenda of energy corporations, reclaims the privatised, marketised elements of the energy system, and restructures the global energy system to achieve net zero emissions while ensuring job creation and democratic control of the system. They have a very strong critique of the idea of community power. So it's based in the experience of the Energiewende, which was the German energy transition, in which very generous feed-in tariffs, which required a lot of buy-in in terms of what sort of households could buy into energy cooperatives. Yet the generous feed-in tariffs were paid for essentially in higher bills for more working class households. So that created a lot of resentment towards the whole notion of socio-ecological transformations. And that's a sort of logic that contributes to things like the yellow vest movement that we saw in France over the last couple of years. So cooperative power is very cognizant of this critique from TUED, but they are operating within a geographically contingent constraints that are very unique to the Australian context. And so they really need to develop responses that are appropriate to the actually existing socio-technical structures that we find ourselves in. IPS, on the other hand, they are similarly constrained. And just to backtrack for a moment, what we're talking about here is the idea of constrained agency, which is an important component of the labour geography literature, which seeks to better theorise the role of agency and its spatial dynamics. So it thinks about how labour is embedded within social structures and the way that constrains and enables them to act within an economic landscape. So Indigo Power Services is similarly constrained within its own geographical context. Unlike cooperative power, their constraints are largely of their own choosing. It's emerged from a very localised context. It actually uses the geographical constraints to its advantage, to the advantage of its community, in that it can really promote community development, and it can actually use the geographical bounding of the energy transition to enable their own sense of agency and the agency of their community. The Australian context. So this is a future research direction which is underdeveloped at the moment, but there are a few important components that I need to achieve within either my literature review or as a standalone chapter, which establishes the historical, geographical and material conditions that are unique to Australia, and that the dynamics of energy transformation are occurring within. I also need to map out the regime and the landscapes to provide some context of what these structures are. And that will also provide an empirical context for the state of energy-related scholarship in Australia. So just to conclude my literature review, there are three contributions that I make. The first is a novel synthesis of the literature to explore how unions can collectively respond to socio-ecological transformations. I've applied that to new case studies in the Australian context, and by doing so, I'm contributing to the development of a normatively green environmental labour geography. So moving on to the methodology. In the methodology, I'm going to outline the study context, my philosophical grounding, the research design and methods that flow from that, my methods of data analysis to date, and a timeline for getting to the end of my PhD. So in terms of the philosophical grounding, I see myself situated within a weak constructionist realist ontological orientation. So that essentially allows for the fact that social structures are social structures are socially constructed, but that they're not fully determinative. Sorry, I just need to go back to my notes for a moment. So the important thing the take-home thing from my ontological and epistemological positioning is that the climate crisis is based in emissions that come from industrial processes. Those industrial processes are embedded within capitalist modes of productions. So therefore, we can't think about climate change as an ontologically discrete phenomenon, but rather, as a couple of brilliant scholars, Newman and Humphreys, point out, we should need to think about climate change as being internal to the labour process, internal to capitalist social relations, which means that as a condition of that relationship between labour and nature, the solutions to solving the climate change crisis lie in reconfiguring social relations of production and reproduction. So this focus on reproduction poses some problems for the historical, geographical, materialist epistemology that I've adopted, in the sense that traditionally it hasn't dealt well with the messy, fleshy, material and social practices of social reproduction, which has tended to have been viewed through more of a post-structuralist lens. Now, I'm cognizant of the fact there is a tension between a materialist epistemology and post-structuralist methods, but I think from my reading to date, that weak constructionism that I'm informed by provides a middle path between the sort of absolute relativism of post-structuralism and the absolute structural determinism of certain types of materialism. So bearing that in mind, my methodological approach does take on some post-structural elements to explore some of the questions that I'm looking at. And it makes use of things like problem representations, looking at geographies of the future, and prefigurative political approaches to those. So in terms of my research design and methods, I'm doing a comparative case study design. So I'm putting cooperative power in comparison with indigo power. So at the moment, I'm hypothesizing that cooperative power is broadly representative of a form of energy democracy, and indigo power is broadly representative of a form of community power that are necessarily in some degree of tension. So by putting them into comparison, my aim is to be able to determine just how unique cooperative power is in the context of community power in Australia. And in doing so, I began my data collection during March of 2020, just as the COVID lockdown began. So naturally, there were a lot of limitations imposed in the ways that I could collect my data. So all of my data to date has been collected via internet-mediated spaces, which presents opportunities and challenges. So some of the opportunities is that there is a pragmatic aspect to being able to access some of those spaces. So I can join a meeting from home and it's really quite easy to do. I've also found that it allows me to move through various states of the embodiedness. So some of my research participants are known to me through mediums such as Twitter. I kind of think of Zoom as an intermediary state of embodiment from the completely disembodied Twitter world to internet-mediated, more embodied relationship with my participants, which will eventually facilitate the actual embodied face-to-face interactions that I'll be having with them in the future. Some of the limitations, though, is that there's less immersion in the social world, which is an important part of doing ethnographically informed research. And there's also a lack of multivocality, so the ability to be able to hear all of the voices within a research setting. I think this is very true online, where louder voices tend to dominate in meetings, and people who are less inclined to speak up, you're not going to hear their voices in ways that you would if you're able to grab them in person at a meeting, after the meeting or whatever. Okay, so in terms of my participant and case selection, that's been based on a developing criteria, which has developed in an iterative process in relation to my empirical development. So it essentially began by attending a campaign event through Trades Hall, which was to support a proposal for an offshore wind farm development in Gippsland. Through that, I managed to get introductions with key informants who then participated in sort of broad stroke interviews with me to help me to identify what I needed to know about the landscape of labour environmentalism in Melbourne. In my original design, I had envisaged tracking the dynamics at the point of production through to the point of consumption and down to the point of reproduction. So the point of production would have been the campaign around the wind farm. The point of consumption was the retail cooperative that I'm looking at. And then the point of reproduction was a very nascent energy efficiency cooperative that is being established through the Earthworker Cooperative. However, as my empirical work developed, I realised I was much more interested in the prefigurative post-capitalist aims and aspirations of something like cooperative power and also the housing cooperative. So I decided to drop the wind farm. The housing cooperative was just really too nascent to be able to get any good data from. So I've just focused on cooperative power, put them into contrast with indigo power, but I'm still allowing myself the flexibility to expand that if need be. But at the moment, I'm going to focus more intensively on these cases. So that brings me to my sources of data. So I've been looking at documents. I've been doing participant observations of regular meetings. So there have been things like board meetings, planning meetings, and steering committee meetings, which have provided social context to my study, but it's also more importantly helped to situate me as a more trusted insider with the sorts of people who are participating in my research. That then leads to better relationships and better in-depth qualitative interviews with research participants. So the in-depth qualitative interviews started with interviews with key informants and then drilling down into more of the representatives from the member organisations of the cooperative. Another aspect of my research data sources is what I'm calling a social network and discourse analysis. This came out of just activities that I've been doing for my own benefit that aren't particularly methodologically rigorous in terms of being able to map out the relationships between various actors and organisations and discourses within these different cases that I've identified. I wouldn't have called that social network analysis at the time, but I have become increasingly aware that that is a method that I could be employing more rigorously. So that will be a part of future data analysis. So these are just these are some tables of the various data sources. So you can see the documents that I'm accessing from things like websites, internal documents like feasibility reports, prospectus, the rules and constitutions of the cooperative, financial statements, email communications, and then external and public sources. So things like websites, social media, working papers, things that are easily accessible. I haven't done a great deal of documentary data analysis at this stage. I've done some rudimentary analysis to sort of inform my vocabulary around how I approach the cases, but that will be an ongoing process. Participant observations, they have involved events such as planning meetings, board meetings. I'm hoping to attend an annual general meeting this month in person, which would be really nice. But that will, of course, depend on the COVID safe measures in place at that particular office, and steering committees around the energy efficiency cooperative, which I've since dropped. So some of those are ongoing, some of them are less frequent. But yeah, this outlines what sort of people are involved. The in-depth interviews. So I have completed, I think, 15 in-depth interviews at this stage, a mix of key informant interviews, member organisation representative interviews. There have been a couple of follow-up interviews where I've gone back to people to discuss things through a particular framework. And this is the example of my non-methodologically rigorous social network data analysis, which I hope to expand into something where I can map out who's involved where, what sort of discourses are informing particular ways of doing things. So this is something that I will need to develop in a more rigorous way. So that brings me to my data analysis. I've begun to conduct some rudimentary data analysis, particularly in trying to draft a paper for the Journal of Industrial Relations Symposium. To do that, I've drawn on recent methodological work by Jeffrey and Dyson, who explore the aspects or moments in prefigurative politics. So this is based on the extensive field work that they've done over many, many years, really ethnographically embedded work in places like India. But they identify what we call here the 4 I's. So that's improvisation, institutionalization, and impact. So I'm just going to run through just on a very sort of broad strokes level of how actors within cooperative power are talking about what they're doing in relation to each of these points of analysis. So it's beginning with improvisation. Jeffrey and Dyson identify a commitment to action and acting out social alternatives. This comes through in everything you talk about with actors within this within the cooperative. They're very consciously trying to act out alternatives that are far more ambitious than just being simply a community retailer. Like I spoke about at the start of the presentation, their aims are, to address big things like climate crisis, inequality, decline of civil society participation, and doing that while facilitating democratic solutions for people and unions. So, commitment to action is really at the heart of everything they do. No fixed utopia. So the actors that I'm speaking to are very aware of the constraints and limitations imposed on them by the Australian political economy, and that what they're doing conflicts with the ideal forms of state-oriented energy democracy as envisaged by the Tuard network, who they are they're a member of and influenced by and influential on. So it really is that prefigurative ideal of acting out futures within the shell of the present without, any sort of hard and fast blueprints for what that future is going to look like. The ability to act unrealistically, so expanding the politics of the possible. And this has definitely come through. I don't like to put my own judgment on what I'm reading as to whether it's realistic or not, but it was very interesting to hear, say, one participant who is from a community energy group in regional Victoria. When I talked to him about some of those loftier ambitions, he was quite dismissive of it. He really just sees this pragmatic idea of having a community retailer that serves the functions that his community organisation needs. Loves the idea that, what they're aiming towards, but just doesn't think it's realistic within the context of an energy retail cooperative. So it's interesting that there are those tensions, there are those different ways of thinking about things that can be fleshed out and explored in more detail. Institutionalisation, this is really important for what cooperative power are trying to do. So Jeffrey and Dyson identify the thickening of social practice as an important aspect of institutionalisation. The actors that I speak to really view the role of the cooperative as providing kind of connective tissue for bringing together community energy across the state and being able to act at a scale that other community actors can't, simply because they could draw on things like their trade union base. They could get the sort of membership numbers that could then actually have real world impact, which we'll talk about in a moment. Another aspect of that is to be able to provide institutional support for workers engaged in other forms of struggle. So, for instance, at the start of the COVID crisis, they made a commitment to give up 100% of their revenue and turn it into solidarity credits, which can then be either claimed by member customers to take money off their electricity bill, or to distribute that money to other members who might be struggling financially. So you can imagine that when workers are trying to take forms of social struggle, if you have the institutional support that can turn around and say, you are not going to have to pay for electricity bills while you're out on strike, then that enables organised labour and individual workers to act collectively, in ways that are meaningful. The institutionalization of improvisational practices. So it's not, it is a very nascent thing, this cooperative, so you can't really say that they have already institutionalized practices. So it's not yet apparent, but it really is an essential aspect of how actors see their role in the energy system and the broader political economy. So by building some of that connective tissue, by providing that institutional support for workers, they can build up the muscle memory and the sinew and the sorts of things that can make emergent practices, can embed them and help other people to pick up some of those practices.
Kind of
all right.
A couple of more minutes.
All right, cool. Niche spaces. So basically, this is like the cracks in capitalism we were talking before. These actors really are very self-conscious of the role of the cooperative in providing the institutional framework that can nourish the collective action of workers in motion. So they're like direct quotes. This is the way that some of these actors are talking about these things. Finally, impact. Again, very difficult to assess impact for something so nascent, but Dyson and Jeffrey identified the idea of scaling up, and that's really what sets cooperative power apart from other community energy projects, is the union base and that customer member base. So they can build up, if they can draw on that membership base, they can have enough volume to go into the retail market and actually have an effect on it in ways that other community organisations can't do. They can overcome geographical limitations that are self-imposed by, say, having a community energy project in Hepburn or in Ballarat or in Yackandandah, and they can provide that connective tissue. New social and economic opportunities. Like we talked about before, by providing economic stability for workers, they can feel more confident in taking social action. There's probably any number of things that go into that dot point. I kind of run out of time. And the transfer of durable skills, knowledge, or resources. So one of the big aspects of that is capacity building for the union movement. So actors in the cooperative see their role as providing a resource for unions to have the space to be more ambitious in relation to climate change by providing an anchor point that they can organise around, that can help them recruit, that can do things to build their organisational capacity while still acting on climate change, and also having the mental bandwidth to think about more ambitious things. And this is just a brief timeline of where I envisage myself being. I've been held back by COVID, as everybody has, I'm sure. So 2020 was a bit of a loss. I made the most of it where I could. But going forward, I'm still going to need to be doing a significant amount of data collection, which I think should probably take me up until midway through the year. But at the same time, that will be an iterative process of analysis and writing and further data collection. I'm hoping to be in a writing phase by the end of 2021, and then I've got roughly 6 months in 2022 to really do my third milestone, get all my chapters redraft, do the revisions, and hopefully get submission done by midway through 2022. So that is everything. I think I've actually managed to keep it in time, which is a real achievement for me. I'll hand it over to anybody who has any questions or comments.
Thanks, Connor. I'm getting a bit of bounce back from you, but it's all right. The normal pattern here, I think, would be if we would ask Elizabeth if she had, firstly, some particular statement or reflection she wanted to make, and then some questions, and then I'll open it to everyone. I've got a few questions too, but I'll open it to everyone else. But Elizabeth, if you're there, would you like to start with any thoughts you have and potentially any questions you might have as well, whether for Connor or for the team, the supervising team as well?
Thanks. Yeah, sure. That was great, Connor. I thought the same about the written document, that your knowledge of diverse literature is really incredibly impressive, and far ahead of where I am in many ways. So it's a pleasure to be asked to have a think about what you presented. I guess I made some notes when I was reading through the document during the presentation. Am I breaking up? Can you hear me?
A little bit.
I'm just moving to somewhere with a more stable internet connection. One moment.
Yeah, I'm going to turn the camera off. I live in an old place as well. It's hard to get the signal through the double brick wall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I hate going first. This will seem really random, but these are the sorts of things I thought about. And obviously I've focused particularly where I think there's crossover between things you're thinking about and things I think about. I noted your comment in the document about the question of the state, right? And how to integrate, I guess, within analysis that issue. Like I think it's often a case of wanting to make sure you talk about everything because of capitalism is a whole, if you have our kind of methodological approach to understanding the world, but not being able to cover everything. The same goes for the question of the international. I think in doing a local study like yours or like mine about the Accord, sometimes the international and the global nature of capitalism can fade a bit into the background. But I think they're challenges that everybody faces. I would say on the question of the state, what occurred to me is there's an old book called The State Debate, which you may know, and is free on the internet as a PDF somewhere, that actually has contributions from John Holloway and others sort of like him, but also from Simon Clark and Colin Barker. And Simon Clark makes this great point where he's talking about, like, can we actually resolve the question of how the state plays out in the abstract, right? Looking at Marxist debates about the state, and in the end concludes that potentially we can only go further in thinking through how the state works in examining real life situations. So I would say, rather than worrying too much about needing to get across all the literature, Marxist literature about debates about the nature of the capitalist state, actually just look at how the state is operating in relation to your case studies and the movements and unions you're talking about, and then see what literature helps you explain that. Are people still there?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm just typing frantically.
So weird. I thought you talk in one moment in the document about the union's approach to, I guess, what their job is, but also to capitalism in Australia. This is something I've thought a lot about, and I thought there was a really big crossover in something I thought about, which is like, what is the nature of the ALP and the trade unions? What is their relationship to each other? In some ways, they're a little bit indistinguishable, right? The factions that exist within both are the same factions, right? But on another hand, they are quite separate. This complicates how we understand the nature of the state, of the Labor Party and government, about how independent trade unions are, but also in relation to capitalist development. It would be my view, and I think also the view of Carol Johnson, the political scientist, that the ALP has always had and by extension the unions, always had a relationship that capitalism has to be profitable in order for social goods and to flow to working people in Australia. And I think that that is relevant when we're talking about the case studies you're looking at as well. Because I think it means that unions go into any kind of movement for change with a particular logic, either being explicit or implicit. And so then when we jump later in the thesis and your presentation, and you're talking about, well, these unions have this kind of particular approach. Sorry, I took a photo of the slide so I could be a bit more articulate. That, like, you know, where you're talking about a shared solution, differentiated responsibility, and social ecological.
Yeah.
I think that's true. Like, I think you said you read my book, yeah?
Yes, I've not read the whole book, but I've definitely skimmed through relevant sections.
It's definitely not compulsory reading. But there is a bit in it where I'm sort of saying that people went into the Accord with different logics, right?
Yeah.
Some people thought it was going to be this pathway to socialism. Some people saw it as a pragmatic thing to get Labor elected at the 1983 election. Some people saw it as, you know, making capitalism successful. So sometimes I think like a bigger project like Just Transitions can actually, because it's so abstract, it can actually incorporate easily, in theory, all these different people who have these competing ideas, particularly because they all want some sort of change. But then in practice, and this would be my worry about, is Just Transitions really a prefigurative form, or is it a new project of various important structures that may look quite different in practice? Because when you go and implement these sorts of projects, the nature of capitalism's needs, of the stability of accumulation, you know, things like that, then reshape that project dramatically. Certainly that's what I observed with the Accord. Then looking forward to things like Just Transitions or a jobs guarantee, that's my worry. Is this another project of capitalist reinvigoration, which will then subsume those more radical elements, not even just subsume them, but like, yeah, I just wonder. So that's not so much a criticism, but like what, in a fight for a new hegemony, which is necessary, right? Okay, the old hegemony of fossil capitalism is falling to pieces. Neoliberalism has not saved capitalism from itself. There's a struggle going on about how to reassort stable processes of accumulation. Then that's messy, right? So I think part of the problem in synthesizing what's happening is the fact it is so messy. A short note on the use of the word embedded, right? So I'm not no Polanyian expert at all, but one reason why I went for internally related rather than, and that kind of literature that someone like Adam Morton is keen on, is because I think it does a better job of getting around the kind of structural preference of some of the Marxist world, right? Like, because like the economy, Polanyi's saying like the economy has these like social things embedded in it, but it's not a structural thing. These are also like dynamics, capitalist dynamics. So you used embedded a few times when you were talking and in the paper. I reckon I don't know that it fits what you're trying to get at, which is actually something more about how things are internally related. And I think the literature around how does nature, humans, the economy relate to each other, we want to analytically separate these things, but we continually have to come back to the fact that they are internally related, not embedded within each other, because they're not just structural in the, I don't know if that makes sense. I also thought like another issue in dealing with something like prefigurative forms or what trade unions are doing is this is part of a broader social movement which is trying to address climate change, and movements don't have defined boundaries, right? So we can't look at something and say, well, you can have a campaign committee, you know where the boundaries are perhaps on a campaign. When you're talking about a broader movement, there's these really porous edges, and movements also move. So when you look at your case studies, I guess need to think about where does it find itself in the broader movement for change. And I appreciated what you were saying about your methodology, that, you know, you felt your social network analysis needed to be more robust, blah, blah, blah. I'm not sure. Like, sometimes I think we just map things because a social movement or a structure is really diverse and messy, and you're just trying to get a picture in your own head about what it might look like and what relationships look like. So in my master's, when I looked at the global justice movement, I also created this map, but it was a map of like events that had happened, like the S11 protests or the Carnival Against Capitalism, of organisations, of individuals. But really it was a methodological tool to work out, was my interviews and who was I interviewing, was I getting enough coverage of that movement? But it was also a document I could show to other experts and say, well, this is my view on what this kind of mess of a movement, global justice movement, looks like. What am I missing, right? You're situated somewhere else in these debates about just transitions or unions and climate change. What do you see from your perspective that's not covered in the network that I'm kind of mapping out? And that can just be useful in, I think, checking your own, particularly when you're really active on a question and like both inside and outside as a researcher. Like it's not like sometimes your perspective on what's happening can be just have, you know, blinkers because of where you are.
Yeah, absolutely.
But your map's definitely more impressive than mine, which was and the only other thing is, this is tiny but weird, because you say you're talking about unions and labour, but then you use the acronym CPA, right, for one of your case studies, but actually it means Communist Party of Australia. That really, like, it kept rankling with me. Now, I don't know whether that's only me and, like, who's going to read your work, but I wondered whether you could...
I did think the same thing at one point this morning. And also the introduction with some unannounced abbreviations, and that one immediately I thought, so what's the CPA? I mean, it's not, if I recall, it's sort of out of date in the 1980s. But anyway, go on.
Yeah.
You could just call it CPAUS, right? So capital A, little u, little s.
Yeah.
I know it could be weird because everybody you're dealing with is calling it CPA because they don't remember the actual Communist Party or something. But I figure if you're going to publish in labour-related journals, it might just like weird out other people. And there was just one particular moment where you were talking about the history of unions, and I was like, oh my God, he's even talking about unions that were half run by the CPA. And last thing is the cracks metaphor from Holloway. I get what you're saying, right, about prefigurative forms, and Holloway saying perhaps like these are moments in which prefigurative forms can intervene. It reminded me of Klein's ideas about shock doctrine, though, and Friedman saying like ideas are lying around and then crisis happens and we implement those ideas. There's something too automatic for me in both those metaphors, that it's kind of like that capitalism's this solid thing or something, and then moments happen and it's only if we see those moments. And so just have a think about whether it's a good metaphor for you. When me, you know, I'm a fan of thinking about it in terms of hegemony, right? And fights for a new hegemony, both of progressive and regressive sides. Just have a think, like, because I have a, you know, I think Klein's wrong, right, on the shock doctrine metaphor. I'd have to think more about what the cracks metaphor from Holloway. But I don't know. It helps your argument, because actually you're talking about this really sustained growing movement over decades that is pushing forward a different way of trying to think about the future in just transitions, and that doesn't seem captured by the cracks idea. That's it from me.
Yeah.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And Connor, I'll get you maybe to respond, but I'll just try to check if Mel or Joanna, if either of you have got a question that you wanted to ask Connor. or I might ask him to respond to Elizabeth's stuff.
Well, I might just
Either
respond
of
to
you-
that first, and then
go for it.
do some
And if
questions.
you've got a question, just tell me in the chat if both of you got a question. I'll make time for it.
Yeah.
So go for it, Connor. Yeah.
That was absolutely great, Liz. I really appreciate getting that perspective on things. Like I said, I was really excited to be able to get a political economy perspective because, you know, we're not a political economy department. A few points there. I really agree with a lot of what you're saying there. I guess moving backwards, the Holloway metaphor, I think you're probably absolutely right. It was something I picked up because it is an aspect of prefigurative politics literature that I'm, somewhat familiar with. And even the prefigurative aspect has been a pretty recent dynamic that's opened up through the way I'm thinking about it. And it's interesting you bring up Naomi Klein because I know that some of the people intimately involved in setting up this cooperative were very much inspired by her most recent book, the name of which escapes me right at the moment. This Changes Everything. So yeah, there are just some interesting parallels there. So I guess I sort of picked up that prefigurative aspect by the way that a lot of my research participants are actually talking about what they're doing. But I think in terms of actually getting to what the real dynamics going on that this is all situated in, I think that notion of thinking about things in terms of hegemony, thinking about capitalism as as a totality that's constantly in movement would actually be would really strengthen the way that I'm thinking about this sorts of stuff. That point about embeddedness was really interesting. It's allowed me to realize how I am using language in imprecise ways just because it kind of sounds good. But I think that, and you can see a sort of, even in what I'm writing, shifts and chopping and changing from that internal relatedness and then using language like embeddedness without necessarily having a grounding in where those terms come from. So that's going to be really interesting for me to work my way through and try to understand, why I'm using a particular word, what purpose it's serving and where it actually comes from. And I think that internal relation is really important because, when I sort of talk about my philosophical grounding, I look at this sort of the David Harvey approach to moments and internal relations and I think that there's a lot there for me to think about anyway. Some really good suggestions around people I should be looking at. The Simon Clark debate on the state debate. I think that's a really useful idea that you have around locating, first of all, how the case and the unions and the various actors interact with the state and then use that as a jumping off point for finding the right literature. I think that's going to be really, really useful for delving into that particular aspect of my research project. And again, that question of the relationship between ALP and unions, absolutely fascinating. I've had other people say that to me, the fact that when you are looking at the geographically contingent context of Australia, that relationship between the union movement and the Labor Party, that sort of institutionalised relationship really stands unique to a lot of other political, economic situations. So, I think that's definitely something that I need to be thinking about and exploring. So, really, thank you very much for that. That's really great insight.
Can I just say one more thing? You tried to say this at the start. You can't do everything, right? I look at my own book and see big problems with it, right? That there's not enough of the international in there. There's not enough of the state debate, right? And I remember Andreas Bieler said that to me, but who was one of my examiners on the PhD. But it's not because I actually spent a year looking at Marxist debates about the state. But in the end, you can't put everything in, right? Yeah. It's this piece of work, and I think the thing that helped me in the end was thinking, how do I understand the world? What is the picture of my understanding of capitalism that's in my head? What are the one or two concepts that help me explain, that I find useful to explain it, right? And then how am I going to drive that conceptually through every chapter in the thesis? And you start with that, right? So like I start with the concept of the integral state. I didn't write that chapter first. I didn't come to that concept first. I wrote the chapter on neoliberalism first. But in the end, it was like, how do I understand the key dynamic of my thesis, which is how do the unions get incorporated into the accord? So I think if the key thing for you is the prefigurative forms, then you need to start with that, like at the start of that chapter. And you also need to think, I've got all this literature that's doing quite a lot. What is absolutely essential in the, and this you only get to this later, right? You can't kind of do it now. How is this best synthesized, and what are the best concepts to synthesize it with? Which I think is particularly important if you've actually got this really high-level knowledge where you're doing such incredible work, integrating and thinking about these multiple literatures and bringing them together. You run into less problems I think, if actually your work's much more data-driven and you're using small concepts and not thinking about the world in these big ways. But, yeah.
But where's the fun in that?
Can I just say, I'm just conscious of time, unfortunately. I've got some thoughts too, Connor, and mostly I won't go into them because it's not enough time, but that idea of John Holloway and sort of a form of almost an enabling form of activism that surrounds particularly that Indigo case, I was sort of interested to talk to you about. It doesn't seem as radical as it might seem to some of the participants to me. Maybe I'm just reading it wrong. It seems a kind of a sort of, middle-class energy collective kind of thing, it's a thing, but maybe I'm misreading that. But maybe we'll talk about that another day. Because
Which one was that? Was that Indigo or the cooperative power?
Indigo.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. I think.
And so I'm wondering how you're going to handle it. But look, I've happened to have lived in a gentrified country town and see how those things work. So I've got a different view of that. But I wonder whether, given the time though, and given that Melissa's posed a couple of things about your own position in this too, and how you write yourself into this, which are interesting. But unfortunately, we have a kind of job to do here too, which is that Ben and Lauren and Elizabeth and I just quickly need to decide whether things are going okay. I'll make one point to you that, Connor, I really want to make, and I'll make again at the end. I agree with Elizabeth that at some point you've got to decide you're not going to fit everything in this.
Yeah. And
I'm also really conscious of the grunt work you've set yourself for the case studies, and I'm keen to talk to you a little bit about that afterwards when we come back together about just coming out of COVID and getting back into that grunt work. And maybe Elizabeth, you've got some ideas about work in the time post-crisis that you might apply to this, because I think you've got kind of thing on the ground kind of thing you've got to do. That's what worries me at the moment. But can I ask that Melissa and Joanna, unless you've got any final comments, I'd ask that you can leave the meeting. And the same with you, Connor. But Connor, can you keep an eye on the Zoom chat, on the Teams chat?
Yeah.
Because at some point in the next 10 minutes or so, we're probably going to ask you to come back just so we can have a quick word with you before 12:30.
All right.
Thanks, Joanna and Mel, for coming along. And Connor, we'll just watch this chat. I'll ask you to come back in a couple of minutes, or I'll dial you back in if you've still got Teams.
Cheers, Andrew. Appreciate it.
Okay. See you later. Sorry to introduce something terrible to you, Elizabeth, but I'll show you what we kind of have to do. But I also obviously wouldn't mind to chat with Lauren and Ben just to make sure that we understand progress. I'm just going to share my screen quickly.
Thanks, Elizabeth, which is well Andrew's
thanks a lot for that.
Really helpful.
Oh, no.
yeah, this is
I think
just the really ugly form we have to fill in.
So I'll just show you what we've got. We've actually just got to fill this in. I'm happy to make some points. We just got to make sure we say that this has happened. I'm very keen that we make some points about Connor's notes to himself about the difficulties of lockdown.
Just quickly, do we record this part? Do we stop the recording?
Yeah, I think we should stop the recording now, but we'll cover those